Alright, so this is probably going to be a short little video, hopefully. Um, we need to address the question of whether nuclear weapons are real or not. This entire question arising is something that I call the seesaw effect, and I try to be really careful of this in my own life as a truth seeker. So the seesaw effect is this. We're maybe taught something that is a lie, that is incorrect, that is unbalanced. So that's the seesaw being tipped in the wrong direction. And so unfortunately what happens is often there's a reaction to that lie or that incorrect way of doing things or what have you. And that seesaw then would be flipped to the other side. So in order to rectify the error or because of whatever the problem or deception was, people flip to the other side and believe something that is equally as ridiculous or incorrect, but just in the other direction. So one example of that is, the U.S. government lies to us, which, yeah, that's true. We definitely know that's true. Um, Therefore, they're lying about everything. Therefore, that means that there's no such thing as nuclear weapons. It's all just a big control mechanism to terrorize people into following the government. Well, the problem with that is that the government doesn't lie about absolutely 100% everything. That's incorrect. The best lies are those that are mixed in with some truth. And if the government never did anything good for people in the past or in the present, um, people would have already no use or trust for government to begin with, which is not the case. Actually, a lot of people, probably most people still, even now, post pandemic and all the other things that we've had to deal with, probably a lot of the majority of people now still trust government and still see it as offering some value, whether that's just law and order or what have you. Um, And so just because the government is a questionable authority figure, and it's a very questionable authority figure, doesn't necessarily mean that everything that they've ever told us, period, or that the scientific establishment has ever told us, period, or that, higher education has ever told us, period. It doesn't mean that all those things are absolutely wrong or incorrect or deception or, control mechanisms or what have you. But I've seen this especially in the truther community. People understand that there's a certain framework of society, and so truthers, almost by definition, are stepping outside of that framework of society. But then the problem is they become baseless or groundless without foundation, and that can make them even more subject to deception and conspiracy theory, by which, when I say that, I mean stuff that is outright ridiculous or unsubstantiated, even more so than they were before. And so that's something that I try to be really careful about because there was a period in my life when I was being shown all these different things that I did have a tendency to jump on the bandwagon and start believing things without digging into them in enough detail, make sure that they were really credible and so forth. So you got to be careful. The bottom line is, as the Bible says, you have to try the spirits whether they're of God, regardless of where they're coming from, because there are spirits that are going to be coming from all sides, whether we're talking the government or whether we're talking, um, you know, uh, anti-government or other sources. So let's talk today about this idea: do nuclear weapons actually exist? Um, because I know a lot of people who say no, it's all just a big conspiracy and they don't exist. It's a control mechanism. I will say this: I think it's a pretty poor control mechanism. If it is all a conspiracy and a big lie and it's intended to just frighten people into obedience, it's a pretty poor way of doing it. The reason for that is, firstly, the governments themselves would have the information that these aren't real, and most countries aren't using nuclear weapons and holding them over their populace as a control mechanism. You don't typically, I mean, the Pentagon's not like we have nuclear weapons, and if you, the American people, don't obey the federal government, we're going to be deploying nuclear weapons on you. That's not how it works. It's usually international in the sense of the U.S. and the Soviets, for example, have a that mutually assured destruction. So there's, both sides have nuclear weapons, and both sides had better behave because if one side steps out of line, it's going to result in both sides being destroyed, or at least that's the idea behind mutually assured destruction. That's the idea behind everybody having nuclear weapons. And by the way, it's not a bad idea. I actually completely agree with it. I think society would be a lot politer, for example, if everybody had guns and were actually allowed to own and carry them in a manner that was consistent with the Second Amendment. Understand that literally every piece of gun legislation ever passed was an infringement on the Second Amendment. You don't see anything in the Second Amendment about, schools needing to be gun-free zones. And so, where now are the areas in this country that are most likely to be targeted by mass shooters? Well, it's going to be any area that's a gun-free zone. Why? Because the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And so if you have a gun-free zone where there are no good guys with guns, of course a bad guy is going to want to go there and kill a bunch of people. Duh. It's not rocket science. I have heard writers call this the polite society. In a society where everyone's armed, everyone's polite because, you don't want to be rude to that guy you're passing on the sidewalk. He's armed. You want to treat him with respect. Even if you don't respect him as a person, you'll respect the piece that's on his hip, and he'll respect you for the same reason. I think that the polite society, it's a very American idea, and I think it would work really well. The government, of course, or I should say the establishment, the greater establishment doesn't want the people to be armed because and armed people can't be tyrannized, and they want to tyrannize us. They have plans for us. And so you will be seeing, and we're already seeing it in various ways, various creative ways. They're trying to disarm people, um, and that will not stop anytime soon. I'm sure we'll continue to see that play out in various ways, whether we see it via taxation, via regulation, via attacking the industry so guns just aren't getting made anymore, ammo shortages, you name it. Anyway, let's get back to the subject, the matter on hand, though. So I really don't have an issue with nations having nuclear weapons and with this concept of mutually assured destruction. I think it was really stupid of Obama to decommission a ton of our nuclear weapons without getting anything in return for that. I think if nuclear weapons are a real thing, then we should have as many of them as we possibly as we need to be able to hold in check all other parties. And I know that that could potentially lead to an arms race. Sure, whatever. Life is an arms race. Let's just be realistic here. In warfare and in the rivalry between nations, nations are always seeking new technologies that will trump the other guy's technology. That's never going to stop. There's no way to ever stop the arms race. And so the nuclear arms race is just another arms race. There's going to be some kind of arms race that's going to go on. Whether we're talking about an AI arms race, so to speak, whether we're talking about an EMP arms race, whether we're talking biotechnology or, biological weapons arms races or computing arms races, whatever. There's always going to be an arms race. It's just the reality of human existence. Um, so, no, I don't have a problem with nuclear weapons. I'm glad that I have not seen them used in my lifetime to my knowledge. Although it wouldn't surprise me if there have been incidents where they have, in fact, actually been used. Let's just go with. I wonder a lot about this event because it does not fit. Let's just say there's a lot of questions surrounding this. I think this was some kind of Soviet airburst weapon test. Um, I think that is the most logical explanation of the Tunguska event. And we're told no, that maybe it was a piece of antimatter that hit the Earth. Sure. I'm not convinced that antimatter exists, and I have good reason for that. Anyway, let's ask this question though: do nuclear weapons exist? Do they? Well, we got to start with because here's the general idea behind it. Okay, so you might have certain types of energy, and that energy can be released in a controlled fashion or in an uncontrolled fashion. So think about the gasoline in your car, for example, the internal combustion motor. So within your vehicle, it's being the energy that is in that gasoline tied up in chemical bonds. As far as I understand it, I'm not a chemist. Um, and then there's a process that breaks those bonds and releases that energy, and then that's used to drive the motor of that vehicle and get you from A to B. And that's what's going on in your car. That's a controlled release of energy. Um, but you can also have an uncontrolled release of energy even with gasoline. The example would be dumping gasoline on a campfire. Have you ever dumped gasoline on a campfire? I have. Um, that is an uncontrolled release of energy. If you've ever done it, you know what I mean. Another example of this is I was camping with some engineering buddies when I was in college. We went out and camped in a swamp in Louisiana. And at the end of the camping trip, some of the guys had the idea of throwing the extra bug spray cans on the campfire. I did not participate in that, by the way. That was not my idea. I didn't do it. Don't blame me. A little bit of an irresponsible thing to do, but these are engineering students. If you've ever been to engineering school, you kind of know what I'm talking about. These are the guys that just do things for the sake of seeing what happens. Um, so let's say you have a can of bug spray, insect repellent, and you spray that and you hold it over a lighter. What's going to happen? Well, you get a little flamethrower effect there. That is a comparatively controlled release of energy right there. But what happened when my buddies threw these spray cans of insect repellent on the fire is an uncontrolled release of energy. One of them blew up in a massive fireball that lit everything within the fire pit, within like 15 feet of it on fire. All the grass was smoldering. It was quite impressive. And then the other one actually exploded into a 15-foot high mushroom cloud. So, some pretty entertaining pyrotechnics. But there's a big difference in the result between a controlled release of energy and an uncontrolled release of energy. And so let's talk about nuclear power. So my dad actually served about 9 years in the U.S. Navy, and he was a junior officer on this vessel, the USS John C. Calhoun. So you can see some information about the John C. Calhoun here, a James Madison class fleet ballistic missile submarine. So this was I believe the slang is that it was a boomer. So it was a nuclear powered submarine, first of all, but then it was also a boomer, which means that it's a fleet ballistic missile nuclear submarine, or in other words, it's a submarine that has weaponry that is nuclear tipped, whose sole purpose was to be part of this nation's triad of nuclear deterrent. Is probably how that goes on to continue there. Um, so it was nuclear powered, and when I say that, I mean that the system that powered or drove the submarine, that generated electricity on the submarine, and that drove its propellers and actually propelled it through the water, was a nuclear reactor, and then it also had nuclear weapons on board that ICBMs basically, or something similar on board that vessel. And so let's talk about both of those things, because one represents a controlled release of nuclear power and one represents an uncontrolled release of nuclear power. So I just pulled up this little fact sheet. Hmm. So I don't know where this document's from, but it's actually from a Japanese site. Interesting. I just pulled it up. It was information on the U.S. Nuclear Navy. And I'm just going to read this. These stats may be more or less correct, but the general idea here is that the United States has a lot of nuclear powered vessels in the Navy. They run these things, every single day of the year for decades on end. And the Navy is very, very good at safe nuclear reactor operation. It is an extremely safe way to generate power. Unfortunately, there's just a very negative public perception of nuclear power, and that's why we don't use it as much when really we should be. It would be a source of unlimited unlimited energy if we wanted to tap into it. Unfortunately, for political reasons, we don't, and that's kind of sad. That goes along with something I've mentioned in my other videos. We don't really have a resource issue in this Earth realm. We have a management issue. Um, but we have a problem with the direction that we're going and the people who are taking us in that direction. Anyway, this just says here U.S. nuclear powered warships have safely operated for more than 50 years without experiencing any reactor accident or any release of radioactivity that hurt human health or had an adverse effect on marine life. Naval reactors have an outstanding record of over 134 million miles safely steamed on nuclear power, and they have amassed over 5,700 reactor years of safe operation. Currently, the U.S. has 83 nuclear-powered ships, 72 submarines, 10 aircraft carriers, and 1 research vessel. So they do tend to be larger vessels. Um, and when it says steamed, let me explain to you how the nuclear reactor works on a ship in general terms, because I'm not a scientist. And this is what my dad did. So my dad went to, he has multiple engineering degrees, but his first one was in electrical engineering. Then he went to the Navy's nuclear power school. Then he was a junior officer on the John C. Calhoun, managing the reactor on that vessel. The John C. Calhoun has since been decommissioned. Um, so safely steamed. So what's going on here? Well, so nuclear power is generated from nuclear, let me make sure I get this right, fission, nuclear fission. So remember we talked about how energy in gasoline is caught up in the chemical bonds within the gasoline. And that when those bonds are broken, that energy is released. It can be a controlled or an uncontrolled release of energy. So there are also bonds within um, atoms, I guess, or nuclear fuel or what have you that can be uh, broken. That's nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is actually fusing two nuclei, I believe, together to generate power. That's kind of next level power generation stuff. We're still doing nuclear fission, which is splitting the atom instead of fusing two atoms together. Uh, so nuclear fission, splitting the atom and generating power that way. So the controlled splitting of the atom, this nuclear fuel, generates heat, and then that heat, basically, it's just a big boiler system on these nuclear submarines. That heat's used to boil water. That water is used to drive uh, steam turbines. And so that's what they mean when they say that it is 134 million miles safely steamed on nuclear power. That's what's going on there. It's basically a complex steam engine that is used to generate electricity for the vessel and also to drive the vessel. That's all that's going on there. But it's a controlled release of nuclear power. Now, understand something. That's a thing. There's no reason in my mind, because I know that this is literally what my dad did on a submarine. There's no reason in my mind to think that it's all a big conspiracy and nuclear power doesn't exist. If it was all fake, they would have to have some other fuel source that they'd be using. Maybe like diesel. They used diesel submarines during the World Wars, to my knowledge, or some other fuel source. But it makes perfect sense to me that nuclear power is real. It's not as complex or high tech or next gen as you might think. It's just uh, a way to create steam and drive these steam turbines and make a vessel work, make these vessels go. So my point here is that this version of steam power, there's no doubt in my mind that it's real. The controlled release of atomic power, if you want to call it that way, or nuclear energy, or whatever label you want to slap on it. Let's talk about the uncontrolled release of nuclear power. So, if the controlled release of it is possible, isn't the uncontrolled release of it also logically then possible? And that would be your nuclear weapons. You just have a certain mass of fissionable material, I guess, um, that is allowed to go critical and react all at once. Now, like I said, I'm not a scientist. This is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But in so doing, you're releasing in a chain reaction a whole lot more energy in a very violent and uncontrolled manner, and that's literally the definition of an explosion. It's an uncontrolled release of energy in a chaotic manner, and a lot of different things can explode. Gasoline or some of these other flammable fuel vapors. But even things like flour, if you get enough flour particulates in the air, that can explode. There have been numerous large-scale explosions that have. Let's look up the Black Tom incident, and then let's look up the Halifax fire. I just want to point out something that it is kind of irrelevant, really. The question of whether nuclear weapons exist or not, because there are conventional weapons that are incredibly powerful that can level cities. And so, whether we're talking nuclear powered weapons or conventional weapons, it's all irrelevant. There are city busters. I mean, that's just the reality of it. There are city busters, and there have been for, 70 years. I don't know. And let's look at some of these Lebanon explosions, too. Because there have been some pretty. Mm, how big was the Beirut explosion? Yeah, I mean, these uncontrolled explosions can be pretty incredible. How big was it? Killing 218, leaving 7,000 injured. Considered to be one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions, damaged 77,000 apartments. So pretty big. I guess this graphic is sort of showing, yeah, the extent to some of the damage and stuff. So here's your explosion, and then, yeah, effects of the damage. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that too much. You guys can dig this up for yourself. But in history, there have been conventional explosions that have been pretty powerful enough to level or almost level cities. The Halifax explosion. There was a vessel laden with high explosives. I forget the context. I think this was in the context of the World Wars, and it was thought that a spy blew up this one, and it destroyed pretty much half of Halifax, if I recall correctly. 2.9 kilotons of yeah, at the time it was the largest human-made explosion. My point here is it is really kind of a moot point of whether nuclear weapons exist or not. Are there city busters and devices that could take out entire cities? Yeah, there absolutely are. But it fits perfectly within my paradigm that nuclear weapons do exist. I've never seen any credible information to the contrary. I've heard a lot of people saying, "Oh, do your research, look into it," but no one's ever given me anything credible to work off of. So I'm just seeing, the say so of some naysayers. And given my dad's background and what I know, and even things I've studied myself. So my thing was I studied history. I started off in engineering school, wasn't a good fit for me. I turned to history. I studied East Asian Civ in detail, and I studied Nagasaki and Hiroshima, actually, in a lot of detail, in the after effects and things like black rain and the weird diseases that popped up in the aftermath of that. Um, Ultimately, do I really know with 100% certainty that those were atomic bombs that were dropped on those cities and not conventional weapons? I don't know. Um, but you got to be careful about drinking too deeply from the certain of these conspiracy theories. I There's no doubt in my mind that nuclear weapons are real. Now, I'm going to leave the comments intentionally open on these videos, and if people can change my mind on that, fine. I may do another video down the road saying, okay, you guys convinced me. Nuclear weapons are fake. It is all one big hoax. But it actually fits in my worldview, and what's fascinating to me as well is it fits within Bible prophecy. There's scriptures that talk about people having the flesh consume off their bones while they're standing on their feet. There's scriptures about Mystery Babylon being destroyed in just one day by a surprise attack launched by an Eastern coalition of powers. And that entity, Mystery Babylon, is destroyed by fire that can't be quenched and by arrows that don't miss. So that's kind of interesting because arrows that don't miss, well, if you know anything about arrows in the ancient world, they were just kind of spammed out there in many cases, and a lot of them would miss. So arrows that don't miss were clearly in the scriptural context talking about some future weapon that is it's not an arrow necessarily, it's a missile weapon, but it's not what we think of as an ancient arrow. I do think the Bible talks about nuclear weapons, and so in light of these things, I'm not willing to accept that claim that nuclear weapons are just a conspiracy theory. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Um, but it the idea that human beings are always looking for a bigger stick, and like I said, nuclear power is used for some productive things. But any technology, humanity always sure will use it for some productive things, absolutely. But it's always a big priority for us, for some reason, to apply that technology to warfare, destruction, and killing as well. And so I see that that's exactly what's happened with nuclear power. It can be used to run entire cities in a very clean and responsible manner. Um, Free energy, basically. Now, there is the little problem, and it is a little problem. It's something that's very manageable if we really put our heads together about it and worked it out of what to do with the nuclear waste that's a byproduct of running a nuclear reactor. But that is something very manageable that we could figure out, I'm sure. Uh, But nuclear power can be used for very productive things, or it can be used for very destructive things. And that just fits with the pattern of human technology and development that we've always seen going back hundreds of years. It fits with human nature, and it makes sense in context of with many different things, many sources of energy. You can control the release of that energy, or it can be uncontrolled. That's exactly what we have here. So I think I've laid out my case here fairly clearly. As I said, I'm going to leave the comments open. If you believe that nuclear weapons are a big conspiracy and that it's all made up, by all means, feel free to set me straight in the comments. And when I say that, I do mean give me something concrete that I can dig into and not just, he said, she said, or this and that. Um, do give me some actual stuff that I can dig into that is conclusive. But yeah, thank you for watching. I am going to make a prediction in this video, and that is I think I kind of hinted at it already earlier on. Uh, the rise of America, the world's first modern superpower, really, what caused that rise was our vicious willingness to use nuclear weapons against an enemy. And it was just the scale of destruction and the wantonness. And actually, if you look into the history, there is a huge debate about concerning the deployment of the atomic bombs, whether it was even necessary at that point or whether Japan could be made to capitulate without needing to invade the Japanese homeland. Um, but Truman was very much a racist who saw Asians as lower even than blacks in his particular estimation of things. Uh, he really did see the Japanese as subhuman. I believe it was Truman. Let me just look that up real quick to make sure I'm not misspeaking on that. Which president dropped the atomic bomb? I'm pretty sure it was Harry S. Truman, who was an extremely racist man. Yep. Yeah, there's actually quotes from this guy. I can't even say them on YouTube because my video will get um, censored, banned, dropped, whatever, and I'll be booted off of here. I have several community strikes at this point already, so I'm not going to push it. But Truman had his hierarchy of who he thought the valuable people in the world were, and on the very bottom of that list were Asians. They were basically animals, fit only for the slaughter, in his view. Um, was that necessary? Well, at any rate, it certainly showed that the United States is a very ruthless power, and it catapulted us to being the world's one and only superpower. It's interesting to me in the scriptures that the Bible says that the things that Mystery Babylon has done to the other nations of the world are going to be done to her. And so it would not surprise me if, in keeping with historical cycles, that the next rising power, the next world order, that the beginning of their rise is sealed with use of nuclear weapons. Another rising superpower shows that they are ready, willing, and able to use nuclear weapons against their enemies. And that will cow the rest of the world into a measure of submission. And I think the receiving party when that happens is going to be the United States. I've been since summer of 2019 when I wrote the book How America Ends. I've been very clear. I think America is going to be destroyed during a nuclear strike by a coalition of Eastern powers in the middle of a civil war. And so that is my prediction. Not only are nuclear weapons very real, but we will see them again probably within my lifetime if I live long enough. So we'll see. I'm sure we'll get an answer to this one way or another sooner than we'd all like, possibly. All right, well, thank you for watching. Have a good one.